Are you an enterprise dissatisfied with overpriced analytics software that can't keep up with modern data? If so, then GravWell is the solution for you. GravWell is an unstructured data analytics platform for enterprises who demand total data visibility across their network. GravWell lets your security team go beyond the SIM and fuse data sources to correlate and answer questions you didn't know needed to be asked. Go to gravwell.io/securityweekly for an unlimited data trial and gain uncompromising visibility today. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. This is the security news. Before we get into it,
RSA conference.
RSA conference. Okay.
Yeah, you haven't covered that one yet.
RSA conference February 24th through the 28th in San Francisco. Visit securityweekly.com/RSAC 2020. You can sponsor an interview with us. That's right. If you want to get information out to our audience about what problem you solve and why you do better than everyone else, you can sit down with us at RSA and record an interview that will air on Enterprise Security Weekly. Also, if you're going to be at RSA, we'll be in Broadcast Alley. Stop by and say hi. We'd love to see you. And it's going to be a lot of fun. They've done a great job, I think, of, I don't want to say formalizing HallwayCon, but helping people connect with other people that have similar interests and giving you space and coffee.
Yes, engagement zone. It's
engagement zone. It's right above where we're going to be.
Where we're going to be. So it's great. You go over there, engage, come downstairs, say hi to Paul.
And Matt.
No, say hi to Paul. Nobody wants to see me. Everybody wants to see Paul.
Say hi to Paul. Come punch Matt in the nuts.
Yeah, exactly.
If you get the two mixed up, it's okay. I won't be there.
I was going to say, Larry, are you going to be? Oh, no.
No. He got out of it this year.
This year, right?
This year.
So what do we have for stories this week?
Oh, I thought we should cover this story called securing containers with zero trust. I think I might know who wrote that article.
Right? I saw this article. I'm like, I want to read this article. I'm like, oh, it's
the whole last segment or half of the last segment.
Yeah, exactly. We could skip it.
Yeah, I think we covered it.
But I do want to highlight
Although Jeff might want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Several.
Jeff, if looks could have killed, we'd have been asleep.
There are two.
Oh, wait. Are we doing the news now? Okay.
Yes, we are.
Let's do it.
There are two very specific challenges. Peter, you touch on one of them specifically in this article in terms of networking and storage inside of containers, both of which are like the bane of my existence lately as to how they translate to the like just smattering of ways you can deploy containers in images, right? Is how you network them together and then how you get them to share data in terms of storage, right? It's a challenge, not just from like an architecture perspective, a deployment perspective, but also a security perspective. Those two aspects are very kind of like abstract with multiple options in each of them, and all of that, depending on where you deploy it, really changes your not just like architecture and deployment, but also your security strategy as well.
Absolutely. My two favorite topics. My last company I started was a storage company. So storage and networking. The cloud and containerizations have completely revolutionized how we do networking and storage. And what's really interesting is just how divergent the solutions are, even just across providers. The difference of networking in Azure versus AWS, Kubernetes versus Mesosphere. It's just, it's really a great time to be involved in that stuff.
And security has to evolve and adapt as well, because it's changing our paradigms every single day.
And it's interesting, you have on-premise deployments, you have 3 different cloud providers. Then within each of those, you've got different deployment and control/management mechanisms, right? You've got Swarm, you've got ECS, you've got Kubernetes, you've got Docker Compose, right? And then those change whether it's on-premise or in the different 3 cloud providers. And that's really where my struggle is. You can define an application like I have recently locally using Compose. And that's typically where I start. Like, especially with legacy applications, which is the topic of my research now and upcoming day at InfoSec World, is how do you get legacy applications inside of containers? Whether you wrote that application yourself or it's off-the-shelf software or open source software, how do you then, like my strategy is, let me get it running locally first. Deal with all the code and application issues, get the storage and networking running locally, then go, okay, I want to deploy this to the cloud. What is the best deployment mechanism for my requirements that take into account my deployment strategy, my development strategy, but also my security requirements as well? It's not easy by any stretch of the imagination.
No, indeed.
So I'm not alone. Like sometimes I feel I'm like,
you are not alone.
I'm like, why does it have to be this hard?
It's also a challenge for vendors, right? Because there are so many different standards, so many different approaches that are being invented in real time, and vendors are trying to keep pace with it. So it's really important when you're selecting products to really understand what it means to have container support. Does that support the kind of containerization I use today? If I use ECS or if I use Kubernetes or Mesosphere, I think really what you should be looking for, and I know this might sound like I'm favoring my own solution, but it's important to look for solutions that abstract away those distinctions.
Yeah. Right.
There are technologies where, because of the approach they've taken, those distinctions of the difference between ECS and EKS and straight Kubernetes and Mesosphere, that makes a difference. But there are also solutions where, because they take a fundamentally different approach, the differences simply are immaterial. So really understand what you're getting into when you go and you check the box on container support, check the box on supports Azure, supports AWS. Well, how? Right? Because those distinctions in the early days of innovation, they make all the difference in the world.
I tend to favor security solutions that support my container, regardless of where I deploy it, right? And one of my concerns is that when we move to the next evolution of serverless, is that it becomes platform dependent. Once I go serverless, at least beyond the user to kind of like web server or application interface, right? Like I can always put a proxy server in front of it and be cloud provider agnostic. However, that's only one layer, right? Like once I get into all of the microservices that and cloud services that define my application, I start to lose visibility and control that is tied to what cloud provider that I'm on. And that's where I really struggle with how do we find security solutions that are really truly application and platform or hosting provider agnostic today, when we have those container solutions, also serverless solutions, also on-premise solutions, that conceivably the other aspect to this matrix is you could have all three, right? I could have aspects of my application that are hosted on premise, some that are in containers, and some that use a serverless type of application.
And you have to ask yourself, what are you giving up to have that sort of support? A good example would be the industry has gone through a couple different shifts. Sidecars used to be the greatest thing, and it gave you compatibility with the broadest range of offerings. But what did you give up by using a sidecar? You gave up the depth of visibility. Now eBPF is now the new hotness, right?
Yes.
And eBPF gives you a much lower level visibility. It's
if
almost
you have
kernel
access
level
to the platform.
Yeah, but exactly.
Right.
So there's all sorts of trade-offs that are happening because we are in such an early stage of development, and the rate of transformation of these platforms is happening at a rate that you would expect at the early stages of development. Like if you look at the rate of change of a legacy platform like MySQLD. In the early days, they had millions of lines of code that were being contributed and modified at a rapid rate. And nowadays, though, the rate of change in those programs, there's a massive base of code that just stays the same for long periods of time. We're so early in the creation of these new models of compute and whatnot that it's hard for vendors to keep pace with the change. So instead, they're looking for strategies for integration that will survive change over time, and those come with compromised decisions. Going with sidecars is a great example.
But one of the challenges and potential benefits is how quickly can I iterate through those versions, right? Use MySQL as an example. When you go from 5.7 to 5.8, there are some fundamental changes that you have to take into account. One is how it does authentication. It greatly improved for security's benefit. 5.8 uses SHA-2 encryption. It's like cached SHA-2
or something
it's like they call it cached SHA-2 passwords is their mechanism. I haven't delved deep into it, but it's basically a more secure way to store passwords in the database. But the applications haven't evolved across the board to support that mechanism. So while it's easy in a container and or hosted environment to go, I'm going to go to 5.8. Now your application breaks.
It is kind of an interesting point. Does that mean that we're going to have silos of legacy, just like we used to do with Windows, and I guess we still do, where people were hanging out on Windows 95 for a really long time, and then they were hanging out on Windows 7
now
for a
they're
really
hanging
long
out
time.
on Windows 7, yeah.
But now they're hanging out on MySQL 5.7 because the application, either they wrote themselves or that they implemented from open source.
And they can't justify the investment to match the change in standard to get to the next level. And are we going to find the same thing with containerization, where there's a lot of people that are stuck in these very legacy versions? How about people that adopted Mesos? I think Mesos is a great platform, but the fact of the matter is the majority of organizations adopting containerization right now are going for Kubernetes.
Yeah.
So are you going to have a massive
Swarm's the same way with Docker. Yeah.
But it even comes down to your app. I built a proof of concept React app just to put it in containers, experiment with different deployment models. I put it on MySQL 5.8. The sample app, to your point, Peter, that I copied from Stack Overflow, was configured for 5.7. To get that to 5.8, I had to upgrade the libraries in my package.json, right, to get it to the right level that it supported that authentication. In that process, I likely could have broken my application code that was relying on those JavaScript libraries that now that I had to upgrade.
No, you did, though. You did. I saw
right?
in my command and control system that your app was broken when I was poking around on your machine.
Right?
Speaking of poking around on your machine.
Hey, is there a news story that we can talk about?
Let's talk about some news.
That is news. That's our own news, Jeff. I mean, that is some genuine
I get it,
news right there for folks trying to do application development or security and some things to.
So, Jeff, where do you want to take us? You got a PCI story?
I got one.
I do. Hold on. Jeff, I do want to talk about the Wawa breach.
Okay.
Admittedly, I did not have as much time as I would have liked to read about this, but I saw this Wawa breach come up in every single news feed that I was looking at. I thought 30 million payment cards compromised was a lot, even by today's standards. But you and I both know, it's not just the devil's in the details, right? It's not just the card number. You also have the CVV. You also have the expiration date, some of which can be derived, and there's other mechanisms in place. How impactful was this breach, in your opinion, Jeff?
So, I mean, it became newsworthy today because the data that was stolen from Wawa has started showing up in the dark web, and it's offered for sale. I confess I didn't have much time to dig into the details, but based on what I had read previously, where it seemed like it was, and I'm distracted by the Slack channel. Sorry. It seemed like they were harvesting cards over time, probably at Wawa convenience stores, at the pumps, which are in the vernacular of PCI or unattended payment terminals. They were capturing the data that was coming out of the card reader, which if it's a debit card, the PIN is already encrypted, so you're not going to get that. But if it's just the swipe data, which by the way, gas pumps are notoriously behind and have been exceptions to the implementation of chip and signature in the U.S. So if you're swiping, you're getting all the track data, which includes the CVV, which is the electronic version of the 3 digits that's printed on the front or back of the card, depending on what you have.
Jeff, just to use an analogy, the Magstripe data, right? When you go to a pump and you put your card in and you pull it out, that's basically like your username, your password, and your 2-factor authentication, basically all in one like glob of data.
Well, it's basically the information that's printed on the card. So it's your name, it's the card number, it's the expiration date, it's the security code, which is the 3 digits or 4 digits if it's an Amex card, which are supposed to protect against somebody just copying the data and cloning the card. Because in theory, that if you look at a classic credit card, the security code's not embossed, it's not raised, so it's not. It goes back to the old days of the chunk. Cards. It's not copied. But because because gas pumps have not yet been required to update to chip and signature, you're still getting track data. It's not encrypted. It's straight ASCII that goes into whatever, from the card reading device into whatever is considered the point of sale system. And if that's where the interception or the data harvesting is happening, it's all there. I'm guessing that's what's happening with Wawa. So you're getting all these cards and you've got all the information you need to clone the card and commit fraud. So it is a big deal.
But it's a big deal because the reason that in the U.S. we went to the chip and signature was to prevent against this really easily clonable. In other words, Larry, you're reading the Kingpin book by Kevin Paulson, which really goes into this whole thing. Like back in the day, largely before PCI, like credit cards didn't have the chip in the U.S. And if you were to steal the Magstripe data, you could clone those cards. And there was also provisions for debit cards that didn't require the PIN, which were more easily clonable, right? Like basically I could clone a card, walk up to an ATM, not need any type of other validation other than like I swipe the card and get cash out. Is that correct?
Can you give
mostly?
Can you give a little historical context for why we didn't adopt chip and PIN in the United States?
No effing clue.
So here's the stories I've read over the years is that implementing the PIN component was a major upgrade to a lot of the merchants in their devices, in the terminals, and so the cost prohibitance of going to full chip and PIN really limited that adoption in the U.S. where you have it over in Europe, and so we went to a chip and SIG because we didn't need a sophisticated upgrades in the hardware. So I think it was a cost issue for a lot of the merchants and a pushback on that cost.
Presumably today, though, we could do it.
An ATM card is like a mag stripe in a pin, correct? Like when I put my...
Yeah. Well, ATM cards largely don't exist anymore. I carried an ATM card up until like maybe 2 years ago, where my credit union said, "Okay, we're getting rid of the ATM cards. We're going to issue a debit card."
And I think Paul is also thinking the same thing. It's now debit card, same thing, Magstripe with a PIN.
I may still have an actual ATM.
Oh, it's possible.
ATM
You
card.
live in Rhode Island. I don't know.
Well, largely because I've not wanted the debit card. I've wanted the ATM card with the PIN number on it.
Well, and it's different data flows in terms of banking, and it gets kind of complicated. But an ATM card is not generally usable at retail locations as a debit card. It's strictly limited to ATM cards, which is why I liked it, because then I avoided the temptation of, spending all my money needlessly. What Matt was saying was correct. I think it is largely a cost issue, and in the grand scheme of things, a lot of merchants had just gone through an iteration of having to replace all their point of sale systems, which were essentially computers that had been running on Windows XP. So they just went through an upgrade project to spend all sorts of money to replace all this hardware. And then, very quickly on the heels of that, it was, oh, by the way, let's do chip in something. And so, these companies that use this, they don't want to have to replace equipment every month, not like the general public wants to replace or feels compelled to replace their mobile phones. Strangely enough, companies want to invest in hardware and use it for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I don't know why. It's just a thing.
It's crazy.
So, Jeff, my question is, what is a Magstripe data go for on the dark web? In the old days, it was higher, $10, and then it was coming down. I mean, are we still at $1 a card? I mean, is this a potentially $30 million kind of dark web opportunity for somebody, or have those rates come down even further? I don't know if you know.
Different levels, right, Jeff? Those that steal the credit cards, those that sell the credit card numbers, those that monetize the credit card numbers. Very much, Larry was showing me that he was reading the Kingpin book by Kevin Paulson, right, which kind of goes through the early days of describing that there are those that steal credit card numbers with the Magstripe data, right? They can sell those and make some money on them, but there's also money to be made once you buy or acquire those credit card numbers, that you would either go to ATMs or like they describe. I don't want to ruin the story.
I think I'm right at that point, because
where they go in the book where like Kevin's or not Kevin, but Max Vision's associates, right, have these. It not to sound sexist, right, but they hired young females. To go into high-end stores like in California to use the cards to buy high-end merchandise like purses, like back in the day, Coach purses, right? Then they would set up an eBay store and sell those. And there was also other folks in the underground that would sell the Magstripe readers and writers that would be able to create new credit cards for that to happen. So there was a lot of monetization.
And like as I'm right at the point, as I was pulling up tonight, the point was one of the first largest exposures of credit card numbers was 2 weeks before Amazon got their IPO. And overnight, Amazon made $54 million. But the availability of funds on the credit cards that were stolen in the breach 2 weeks prior was over $1 billion. And if you took away the used credit of those cards and just took the available credit, was something like $970 million.
So to try to answer Matt's question, the short answer is I don't know what the going rate is these days. The trick is you steal a bunch of cards, you sell them in bulk, and so the people that are buying them, they're going through the cards trying to find live cards that have not been deactivated yet. And as we've somewhat described already, the end game is to commit fraud. Stealing the card in and of itself, there is no value in that. It's, can you use the card to somehow get money out of it? And the common method for getting to monetizing or committing fraud with these cards is to buy merchandise that you can turn around and flip and then get get money out of it. I mean, that, whether it's, convenience stores, gas stations like the Wawa, the very common fraud attack is to purchase $1 of gas to see if the card's active, and then go inside the store and buy as many cartons of cigarettes as you can carry to go out and sell the cigarettes. That's a very common fraud method, I guess.
It used to be 2 tanks of gas and a pair of shoes.
Right, but what you'll find in the book, Larry, is that what I think is a great win for PCI that really helped deter this fraud is that before PCI, you could target a merchant, and Max does this in the book, a pizza shop. The first thing that Max found was that the last 5,000 or 15,000 transactions were stored on the hard drive. And so now I've got 15,000 credit cards. I copy those to my system. I then wipe those from the system so that no one else can do that, right? Then I put malware on the system that every new transaction gives me all of that data, right? Now I've got 15,000 cards. I can sell a bunch of those and make some money on to someone else who's going to monetize them. Then I can keep maybe some for myself, that I have a fleet of people, or maybe myself, that if some of those are debit cards back in the day before a lot of the protections that are in place today, I can go monetize those on ATMs in small towns that don't have cameras. I can put a hood on. If the ATM itself has a camera, I can monetize that card because there was some lax restrictions that I didn't need a PIN number, or I had the PIN number from the original swipe, that I could monetize that. Then I also could send other people to the store to buy merchandise, potentially sell that merchandise, right? So it's all about how I monetize that initial stealing, but I still have a foothold in the pizza place, right? And Max literally compromised a pizza joint, right? Every new card that was swiped is being collected to me. I would take those fresh cards, right? Because these are cards that likely, for most part, weren't already stolen, right? Because the data wasn't sitting around. It wasn't part of a breach. These are fresh cards coming in. I can commit a pretty high dollar on the dark web to sell those to someone else who's going to monetize them. So Max actually had 2 different personas. One that was selling the card data, and one that was even buying other people's card data and using my own, that was monetizing that via other mechanisms. This is all, by the way, those that are listening, highly illegal, and you're serving time in federal prison for doing any of these potential activities, right? And all kinds of informants that were informants to the FBI, that were ratting on other people in the carding market, which obviously still goes on today, to be able to either reduce or wipe out their sentencing because they knew that basically they were caught.
What's the average lifetime of a compromised card?
That's a great question.
Hours to days.
Hours to days, okay. There's just so much indirection here, and it seems inevitable that they'll start using the cards to pay for computational time to mine cryptocurrencies,
and that
for the indirection without having to enlist other people.
You're giving them way too much credit.
Well, but Jeff, to your credit, I mean, in the context of the book by Kevin Paulson, right, and when Max was doing this, it was before Bitcoin, right? So they were using, I forget what the payment system was, which is interesting because the FBI actually infiltrated this payment system. People are yelling at me for what it is, but they're
in their car yelling at you right now.
They are. As soon as we publish this, there are going to be people. No. It was. God, I can't think. I said it on a previous show too. And anyway, before Bitcoin, there was a currency or a financial system for. I can create a pseudo kind of anonymous account, but that banking system that they were using was infiltrated by the FBI eventually, that led to some arrests, right? Bitcoin really helped anonymize for these attackers that system, but also created a new market for them in that, to Jeff's point, if I do get a credit card, I could potentially spin up infrastructure to create my own and mine cryptocurrency, and or create a platform where I can compromise other systems to create that cryptocurrency. So it really did change the game in multiple aspects.
Aren't you thinking, Paul, of the tokens that they used to give out at Timeout? The video arcade?
Tokens.
Maybe.
Yeah.
There is
those tokens that only worked in those machines.
Not necessarily a secret, but I don't think a lot of people embrace this. Even with the chip and signature card, where it's dipped instead of swiped, the track data essentially is still passing from the card reader onto the computer, which we typically call the point of sale system. It's still unencrypted. The only thing that the chip and signature does, the chip produces an encrypted sort of authentication value that, in theory, that's what isn't able to be spoofed or intercepted in order to clone a card. So you can still get the card number, and name and expiration, which very often is all you need to use to try to purchase something at an e-commerce site. The use of the sometimes if you buy something, they'll ask you for the CVV, the 3 or 4 digits. Sometimes they don't. It's optional. You as a merchant, you get a little bit of a better break in terms of the rates that you're charged for the benefit of using the cards, but it's certainly not required. So it's still possible, even with chip and signature cards, that were probably cards that were used at during the Wawa breach, even though they were, they still have a mag stripe and they still get to be used as a mag stripe. It's all the same data. It can all still be stolen. It can all be, purchased on the dark web and used to commit fraud. Even if the Wawa was just doing a dip instead of a swipe, which is the vernacular for doing the chip process. You're still getting the same data. You can still commit the same fraud.
Well, right. And what's interesting, Jeff, is that right after I finished the Kingpin book, I walked into Cumberland Farms and I bought a coffee and like a breakfast sandwich or whatever, and I put my card in the chip reader and it was like error. And I did it again. He's like, and I did it again, and it was like error. And he's like, try one more time, and it was like error. And he's like, you know what? You just need to swipe it now. Like 3 times of an error means you need to swipe it. And I'm like, oh shit, I'm totally screwed right now. Like some hacker has my card. I'm totally screwed, because if I were an attacker, right? If I'm not at the pump where it forces you to do the mag stripe, right? I would compromise the chip reader device, and I would force it to error out 3 times so that everyone had to swipe, where I have a much better chance of collecting the data I need to commit fraud.
The difference is, to Jeff, to your point, I think the interesting difference between the mag stripe in the chip is you don't get the CVV. And so in retail...
No, you do get the CVV.
Oh, you get the CVV even in a chip card?
It's still the same track data. It's just not on the mag stripe. It's still. I may be mistaken, but I believe it's essentially the same track data that's transmitted via the chip process, plus the additional authentication value that's encrypted with the logic.
My call to action to our talented audience, after having read Kingpin and having this discussion and a couple of others, is those that I know that we're friends, we've talked, right, Larry? Like we've talked. You're working in this area. You understand the carding market today. Please reach out to us. I will also try and reach out to those that I know, and you and I both know exactly who I'm talking about. The number one person on our list, right? What is going on in the carding market today? That was the biggest question when I finished that book and thought about how credit card transactions happen today, was how does the carding market work today, right? After all those arrests, after all of the advances in protecting credit card data, which largely, I believe, have reduced fraud from where we were 15 plus years ago until today.
Yeah.
I think we have greatly reduced credit card fraud, but it's still, I believe, a mechanism that attackers are using today to monetize their attacks. What does it look like today? I know there are people that Larry especially and you and I know that are working in that area today that could share some knowledge with our audience on how that's working today. I think that would be fascinating. Yeah. Any case.
Challenge issued.
Challenge issued.
I bet your challenge on Tuesday. I can't meet this one. These two have to do it.
I think the paradigm has shifted. I think we're all aware of that. So because I said paradigm.
No, the paradigm has shifted. That's like a whole big drink right there.
Wait a minute, I'll just go right from the bottle.
Yeah, see, I joke with my 617 wireless class that, we talk about, the wireless landscape has changed, like in slide number 3, and I say the paradigm has shifted. And I'm like, I'm management now. I get to say those kind of things.
That's right.
It is very much management term.
I apologize for using management speak. What I'm trying to say is, when PCI came out 15, 16 years ago, the conventional wisdom and the attack methodologies back and then was bad guys going to try to find a way to break into your network, establish some sort of beachhead, if you will, be able to reverse tunnel out. So he's got some sort of more or less static presence in your network. From there, he's going to go look for the crown jewels, the databases that contain the tens of millions of transactions that have all the card data in them, and he's going to figure out a way to steal it all at once and get out without being caught. Nowadays, the attack methodology is much more shifted to, instead of trying to risk, it's a risk decision, good for the bad guys, rather than risk trying to break in networks that have become much more secure over time. It's a lot harder to do it. Find databases where the data is probably now encrypted anyway. Why not just relax, take your time, and go to the endpoints and go to the dozens, hundreds of thousands of retail locations that are using the exact same systems. Figure out a way to they call it scraping the data or something to that effect. Do it a little bit over time, times hundreds of thousands of locations. You end up with the net result over time because nobody catches you anyway, and that's a significantly different attack vector that the traditional security model that PCI is built around doesn't really address or take into account. And I would extend that to a lot of the stuff we talk about with all the vendors and tools and products and all the cool stuff that we talk about sometimes for a little bit too long. It doesn't really address necessarily the way that the attackers are shifting the focus. Yeah. Quick example. I had a conversation yesterday with someone, and we were talking about the MITRE attack framework because I'm still working on my little side research project on mapping the MITRE attack framework to the PCI data security standard. And they were saying, well, what is, and I was explaining to them how PCI worked and sort of the design of PCI from the top down. There's 6 goals of PCI. And they're like, well, what about the recent, thing with Iran and all the new threat that's out there? And I'm like, PCI doesn't really care about new threats. It cares about, can you steal my data? Can we protect the data? It's kind of regardless of what the threat is. The little epiphany that I had is, a lot of the people are worried about threat. It's like it's the new FUD. We used to talk about vulnerabilities. Now we're talking about the threats. I would say all of it doesn't matter. Worry about the risk of losing the things that you care about.
I agree. I agree, Jeff. And
data security.
Having some insight into how the carding market worked years ago, I have a newfound respect for PCI in terms of protecting your data, right? Not storing that credit card data, protecting the track data, getting rid of it, putting more protections in place to prevent that from being stolen. I
I think to that end, I think at the end of the day, and this is my opinion, I don't know if I could prove it or not, the biggest bang for the buck that PCI ever did was more incidental. It caused people to clean up their act.
Yeah.
Where in the early days, data was everywhere and it was not.
I agree.
Yeah,
it was in the premise. It
right,
was in
Jeff,
the
that pizza shop
of routers.
Right. That pizza shop doesn't store those 15,000 credit cards anymore. Right.
Right.
They clean that up. And it reduces the attack surface. Now,
but the motive is companies like, oh, if I encrypt my data, or if I eliminate storage, or if I segment my network, I don't have to do PCI, which I always hear. Oh, I don't have to do security.
I don't know about
that. That's their motive. But in order to just take segmentation, in order to be able to segment your network and be able to say, okay, I've isolated my card data processes and all that is involved with that to this area over here. To be able to do that, at least in the early days, they had to go through their entire network and find where the data was,
right?
Who was using the data, who was accessing the data. So the motive was wrong, but the net effect was they cleaned up their act and they found out, shit, nobody in our organization needs to have card
that data. Right.
Why are we even storing it?
Yes, agreed.
That is the indirect net result that has reduced the footprint of data that people want to steal so that they can commit fraud through monetization.
Lee, Thor Ragnarok is arguably one of my most favorite, and my sons agree, Marvel movies in all the MCU. And now we've got Ransomware that's named after Ragnarok, which I think is really cool.
And it goes after your Citrix ADC devices, looking for Eternal Blue vulnerability, turns off defenders, and just has a wonderful time. I just love the Ragnarok title because I love that movie too. Funny story is when we were first up here in the Boise area, we were looking for a movie theater and we found one and it had Ragnarok. We hadn't seen it. 2 tickets plus the 3D upgrade plus a refillable bottle of popcorn plus 2 large drinks, $24.
Wow.
Yeah, we're living in the wrong states.
That's that's
the tickets alone are over almost 30 plus bucks.
I'm just saying, Ragnarok has a soft spot in my heart
because it only cost you $24
to see it in the theater, which is. But also, I think it's very descriptive of the malware, right? Like, because if you've watched Ragnarok, you know that when they unleash the demon Ragnarok, it destroys the planet, right? And very much, this is what the ransomware is doing.
Yeah, it's turning off real protection, turning off volume shadow copies, turning off the firewall. It's just gonna have its way.
Now, do your servers need to have the host name of Asgard in order for this to be effective, or?
Well, do you want it to work well, or do you want it to just work?
Well, that depends on how you define well, right? Who's defining well?
Right. Is it what is Thor's sister's name in the movie?
Well,
someone tell me what Thor. I've seen the movie.
While you're doing that,
so many times. What is Thor's sister's name in Thor Ragnarok?
Somebody's yelling at you in their car right now.
They are.
Somebody in the car. So this is the story we covered on Enterprise Security Weekly yesterday, Paul, where
I can't believe I can't think of this.
They partnered with FireEye to actually create
Hela
detection.
Hela. Thank you, Hela. Very pivotal character.
Hella good answer.
Thanks, Jeff.
Pivotal.
Glad you did that.
Just
hella good answer.
I love that, and my kids love that movie too, which makes me love it even more. They're like, let's go Ragnarok.
Yeah, we covered this
Thor's
yesterday.
Like, I know this guy. I worked with him. It's awesome. A great line.
Oh, but by the way, Ragnarok will not attack your machine if your language code is from Russia, China, Belarus, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, Latvia, Kazakhstan, or Aubergine.
You know what's interesting in that, as I am listening now, the next book on my list is Sandworm by Andy Greenberg, right? And the whole history behind Ukraine. I like, holy shit. I am ashamed of myself for not looking into being a hacker in computer security, not looking in the history of Ukraine, then looking at the whole history of the Ukraine, right, and all of the shit that they've been through. I'm like, holy crap. But like, why? Like, Russia very much wants to attack Ukraine. Why are they lumped in the same group of like being immune to this malware? If you know the history behind previously Soviet Union and then Russia and their relationship with Ukraine, they're very much not friends. Like, totally not friends.
I'm just guessing they're both places that the people behind Ragnarok feel will do them harm in one way or another, so they're just going to leave them alone.
Interesting.
They're not going to poke the stick in that hornet's nest because it could get bad. Or they're obfuscating it by making a list that's like, well, somewhere over here in this general part of Asia, that was where we are.
Yep, obfuscation.
I like the fact it leaves a how to decrypt your stuff.txt as opposed to a pop-up with with email addresses and your encryption key that's encrypted. Very friendly.
What was interesting is we covered on Enterprise Security Weekly yesterday, Citrix partnered actually with FireEye to do detections for this. And I thought it was kind of interesting because why FireEye? Why not one of the VM vendors? Because you're looking to look for this is you're looking at a bunch of registry keys in Windows that all the vuln detection companies do. I thought it was just a really interesting article that we covered yesterday. Is Citrix decided to partner with FireEye, but not Qualys or Tenable or Rapid7 to actually look for these detections, which was an interesting announcement yesterday on how to detect whether you have been susceptible to Ragnarok.
Speaking of being susceptible, Paul, I like your story number 3 because I thought this was actually quite humorous, even though it's a sad sort of situation.
Yes.
From a security perspective, right, like we're very much about quantifying the risk.
Right.
And my wife works in the medical field, right? Right? And so we get kind of like this secondhand information about viruses specifically that aren't of the cyber realm. And when you look into viruses not in the cyber realm, you realize that like the influenza virus, for example, has killed 6,000 people, which is way more in the U.S. specifically, that the coronavirus is killed in the U.S., posing, if we were to look at that from a security professional, like that poses a lot more of a
risk,
potential, risk or threat to our respective environments, right? But then
drink. There's no such thing as potential risk. It's risk, and it has a value. Continue.
Sure, but I was just covering my bases, Jeff.
So Paul,
to avoid that comment,
is it quantitative risk or qualitative risk?
So
I did a very
qualitative numbers.
So Paul, before we get too far down in the weeds, the story is that the joke is around, has been for years, that every time DEF CON comes up, the joke is DEF CON's canceled.
Yep.
This time, DEF CON is really canceled.
Black Hat.
No, DEF CON is really canceled. Sorry. Yeah. DEF CON China is really canceled only a couple weeks out from the actual DEF CON China
because of the coronavirus.
Because of the Kung flu.
Well, somewhat is.
I thought it was the Wu flu.
Some would speculate, though,
the Wu-Tang flu,
that this virus was, in fact, manufactured by China as a form of population control because the virus has a higher rate of killing people who are immune compromised and or elderly and or children, right? One theory that is out there. However, translate that to the U.S., where influenza kills so far way more people than the potential that
for the same reasons, though. For a lot of the same reasons, right?
Correct.
Elderly, immune compromised, children who can't get flu shots because they're maybe too young and their respiratory systems can't handle the virus. You replicate some of those same things in other countries, they could have potentially more devastating effect.
Now, however, so I think to change that risk calculus a little bit, if we think about influenza here in the U.S., the ones that they're vaccinating for, influenza A and B and a few others, we know how to deal with those. And the drugs, they're not resistant to any type of drugs and any of those types of things. But I think, and I'm just speculating based on what I remember hearing, is that the Wuhan variety is very resistant to some of the treatment. Which changes that risk calculus.
So I don't know how you guys...
we don't have antivirus for this particular virus.
But do you know how flu shots are created in the U.S.? We look at... Well, we look at what happened overseas in the last season, because we're off season from Asia in some respects, and they look at the strains, and then they try to craft the flu shot to look for the main...
The sun never sets on the flu virus.
Right, exactly. And so they look at what's been popular as strains, create that into the flu shot, and then... So that's how they create their formulas for every year to really try to... maximize protection. But then you have something like this that wasn't in those calculations.
Didn't exist.
It didn't exist.
Didn't exist.
Now it exists. And so all of the flu shots that my wife bring home every year and pokes in our arms, there's no protection.
Right. Well, not only is there no protection, that once you're compromised, there's very little you can do to recover, or it's difficult to recover.
There's a corollary There's a corollary here somewhere to malware, virus, protection. I don't know what it is.
But we'll never find out because DEF CON's canceled.
Because signatures don't work, therefore... Oh, sorry.
Hey, I want to do some of Larry's stories. He's got some...
I think the big one for me that popped up sort of right before we came to the show is that the charges have been dropped.
Phone?
No, the charges have been dropped against the 2 Coalfire employees.
Oh, good.
So, and the Coalfire and the 2 individuals released a joint statement basically saying, thank you. Thank you to the community for being so supportive. Thank you for the local police departments for being very professional in how they dealt with the problem. And we really want to move forward to help folks not have the same problem again.
I feel bad because...
Remind me, what was was that the pen testers?
Yeah, the physical pen testers that got arrested for breaking into the courthouse.
Wow, that
even though
just
they had
got
permissions.
resolved, wasn't that months ago?
We covered that in November, right?
Yep.
I think we covered that in November.
I feel bad because I don't particularly like any hacking or not, right? Folks that are made an example of for a particular law that happens to be enforced at a particular time that is clearly made to make an example of, right? And this was kind of a case of that, right?
Or used as a pawn to say to these other groups, ha ha ha, we got you.
Right.
And to me, that's sort of clearly what it is that they were 2 distinct groups. Like, this is my building, but this group is authorizing a pen test against it. So you get the pen test against that building, and I don't like you, so we're going to prosecute these people that you authorized to this thing that you really shouldn't have had authorization to do. It was a political pissing contest, and these 2 guys got put in the middle of it.
Speaking of political pissing contests, I find it highly unusual that this decision to dismiss the case came down, days before the Iowa caucus. I don't know what that means. I just think it's interesting.
That's a coincidence. Coinky dink.
Political reasons for that.
No such thing as... It's a potential coincidence. How's that?
I'm pulling your chain there. I think it's very well timed and on purpose.
But I think there is a history, if we talk about hackers and cybercrime, of folks being prosecuted to make an example of, right?
Yeah.
And I just don't agree with that, right? We had
I don't think
Godwin
it's just
on
cybercrime, but
in any crime, you're right, Jeff. Like any crime, that's.
We're going to throw the book at these guys is not cool.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like this was a case of that, throwing the book at them to make an example. not necessarily to support due process.
It did create some elevation around scoping and some of the things you need to do from a pen test perspective.
But
so I think we learned from that. But you don't want the negative consequences of the actual arrest, crime, potential side of that. I think a lot of
I don't want that falling on a particular company, and certainly I don't want that falling on particular individuals who both, in this situation, in my opinion, were acting upon their agreed upon scope and engagement rules in this particular case.
But this was, in some sense, it was a physical analogy to, doing a pen test or some sort of vulnerability assessment where you stumble over or beyond the IP range that's actually owned by the customer. I mean, it was, there wasn't ill intent. It was an accident. It was a sort of a misunderstanding.
I agree, Jeff, that in this case there was kind of like a perfect storm, right?
Yep.
What you heard in our coverage of the story is many of us on this crew and other crews basically saying the same thing. Like, many of us have been in this situation, right? Or had others on our team in this situation where basically, like, there was this mini perfect storm that was, I don't know if it was Tyler or Dave Kennedy that was talking on previous episodes that, like, we were authorizing a pen test, we're breaking into a facility, and it just so happened that the local police department was driving by at the time and saw people, dressed in black and black masks, breaking in the facility. They had permission, but the local police department was like doing their job. I mean, to their credit, doing their job, going, there's people breaking into this facility. I happen to be driving by. Therefore, you need to sit in the back of my cruiser until we figure this out. And I can totally see that. We've all been in those situations. And I can see this happening.
And my understanding was that was what the local law enforcement folks did.
Yep.
They did their job. The coal fire employees, both of them were like, yep, we totally get this. Good. This is great. And they were released. Because they said, nope, you clearly get permission. People talked. And then it came back afterwards.
That they were,
But that it wasn't that they were doing something illegal. It was that the people that authorized
a political pissing contest.
Pissing contest. Because clearly the courthouse had issues, and that this group shouldn't have been authorized to test this other stuff that they allegedly have no jurisdiction over.
Right.
Yeah. No. And
the jurisdiction was an interesting one in this case because it was a rural environment, the sheriff versus the police department.
Yep.
It got really interesting because the sheriff has different jurisdictions and local police departments, and that played into this as well.
And we covered that. But I think the positive aspect is, like we were saying, if you are breaking into a facility with permission, and like there are circumstances where local law enforcement just happens to be driving by in that particular scenario, you hope for everyone's safety that they do recognize that and do say, you need to stop and get in the back of the car until we figure this out. Everyone cooperates, and we're like, it just happens to be that perfect storm.
And honestly, the physical is not the only venue where this shit goes sideways.
That's true.
You think about phishing. You come up with this really great pretext for phishing, and you work with your customer, and you require that your customer has read the phishing pretext and that they approve the phishing pretext, and the chief technology officer and human resources and the chief financial officer and the president all see this thing and they go, yeah, that's a good one. And then you send it in, and all of a sudden because of the pretext, the physical security folks are like, whoa, wait a minute, what the hell just happened? And all shit breaks loose. You guys didn't have the approval to do that type of test because it said something about physical security.
Yeah, I would say as a caution to our readers, while this particular incident more or less has had a positive outcome, that doesn't always happen.
No.
Yeah.
And very often, innocent, non-malicious motives. You're hired to do a test, but for whatever reason it goes south or sideways. It doesn't always end up nicely wrapped up like this. I mean, very often, and I think I might have experienced this personally a few times. Very often things go sideways, and we're not going to deal with it. You're out. Maybe not. You don't end up in jail necessarily, but maybe you lose your job. So just, I wouldn't expect this is the, while I'm happy about this outcome, I wouldn't say this is the norm in terms of positive outcomes.
And if you're on the other side, like the 3 Magecart guys, they're going to jail because they got busted.
Right.
Because if you're doing this on the other side, you're going to get busted, and you're going to jail.
It might take time, but you will.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different landscape today.
Yeah.
Yes.
The previous. Yep. Sure. Absolutely.
Yep.
The other story I thought was interesting that would be a shift in our where we've been going tonight is Larry's number one story. Tell us about how the Saudi hackers hacked Bezos's phone.
So this one became interesting. So Motherboard was able to obtain the technical report for how
is this a SIM swap?
The investigation was conducted against Bezos's phone. Allegedly, Bezos's phone was hacked by the Saudis for multiple things. That we hear that potentially now is all tied to they got evidence that he was cheating on his wife and then gave it to someone, and now he's getting divorced and has to give half of his fortune, that they were trying to ruin his fucking life. Because he owns the Washington Post, and the Washington Post was published a number of articles that were very critical of the murdering of Khashoggi.
Mm-hmm.
I'm amazed that I remembered all of that part.
But that's really good because that's true.
Right, but this is all the truth.
I'm impressed.
So the Saudis hacked his phone, allegedly hacked his phone, and they did a forensics analysis of his phone and tried to figure all this shit out. And what it really turns out that they discovered was he had received a video over WhatsApp for something about Saudi or Israeli or something communications company. He watched the video, and immediately following watching the video that was delivered via WhatsApp, that the data outbound from his phone volume increased exponentially. Like 400, 500K a day data outbound from his phone was typical and is typical of most iPhones. And immediately after watching that video, it went to hundreds of megabytes per day outbound exfiltrated from his phone for a very extended period of time.
So they embedded something in the video that exploited something. Yeah.
Yep. And they were not able to recover the actual video because it was an encrypted WhatsApp. There's a bunch of other stuff. They could have gotten a bunch of other things from the phone, but the investigators weren't using the right tools. And
was he an iPhone user or an Android user?
iPhone.
Was it an iPhone?
iPhone.
Oh.
Yep.
Which is interesting because iPhone has some interesting protection mechanisms built into it. This is one of those interesting breaches where the ability to kind of break out of the barrier of an app and get more data out of the iPhone is an interesting attack.
They burned O'Day to do it. They had to have. They had to have.
Right.
Yep.
You know, they could have gotten a lot of money for that from Apple directly through Apple's bug bounty program, because that is one of those attacks that I think Apple pays like $1.5 million for.
Yeah, well,
clearly the
Saudi $1.5 million to the Saudi government is not even a drop in the drop of a bucket.
But the question is, who built the actual 0-day and sold it to the Saudis? Because he could have made some money, so the Saudis had to pay him more than that. Because the bug bounty on that kind of an attack on an iPhone is actually pretty high.
Again, still, if they paid him $10 million, or they paid the developer of that O'Day, him, her, they, them,
$1 billion.
$1 billion, $100 million. It was still a drop in the bucket. Yeah.
the news was just like all over this with all kinds of ridiculous. I didn't know who to believe. I almost don't even want to talk about like speculate on the show what happened because there was so much news on this story.
Is TMZ going to start covering cybersecurity news now?
Oh God, no!
If they did, it would be this story.
Yep. So
put it that way.
The big things that come down to they did a bunch of analysis to find all the stuff. They found the traffic changes, and they didn't find a lot else. Sarah Edwards from SANS instructor, said, one of the things that they did, why did you even do that? Because any state-sponsored malware isn't going to show up there. Because, duh. Right. And then Vladimir Katalov from Elcomsoft basically said, it looks like the experts who did the analysis weren't qualified enough.
Yeah. I mean, they frickin' did a factory wipe. Things are going to be gone.
Yep.
It would have been interesting to see how that attack propagated on the iPhone because it would provide some really interesting how do you break out of an app, get access to an iPhone.
My whole question in this thing is like, what's the motivation, right?
Well, in this particular case, it was probably just to smear Bezos himself.
Yeah, absolutely, because he was all over the Saudi government about the murder of Khashoggi. Because the Washington Post published some very scathing articles about that whole quote operation.
So they were coming back on him on his not yet revealed affair he was starting to have.
Correct. Or had been having.
He had been having. I mean, this started to come out a while ago, but they were trying to propagate it.
It was before it was really public.
It's one of those, hey, this guy that owns this thing published this thing that wasn't nice to us, so we're now going to go hack his shit and dig up some dirt so we can publish some things about him.
But what was interesting about this in terms of the landscape of these type of attacks is you've basically not just burned your O-Day, but every major CEO and founder of these major technology companies now is on high alert, right? And, look, Amazon security team, they're not a bunch of slouches. Like, they are some of the most elite people in security protecting some of the most sensitive and vast amounts of intellectual property and PI on the planet, right? But now they're on high alert. Now they're advising not just Bezos, right, but all of the high-profile technology company CEOs and founders to be like,
don't click shit.
You're playing in this different realm now. Now, like, they've not just burned their O-Day, but they've burned kind of this, I think, this whole path. Banking on that the people who we know that are doing security for the Amazon, Facebooks, and Google of the world, like, they're no slouches, right? So they've got access to people who can advise them on, like, how this not happens again, right? And so to, like, have it be worth that, like, I hope it was worth that for whoever was targeting their phone for whatever reason.
Clearly, we can all speculate. I would say no because it didn't destroy Bezos, but Jeff.
It didn't, yeah.
To put it another way, Paul, I mean, I was at Amazon last fall. They had an internal crypto conference where there was probably 250 people that were focused on cryptography. And I was like, wow, I haven't seen this since I worked for the government.
Agreed.
And it occurred to me, and I think, Facebook, Amazon, Google, they all qualify in terms of their budget, in terms of the number of people and just the resources they have to throw at these problems. They're nation state.
Yeah, I mean, throw Apple and Google in that mix too, right? I mean, you've got some of the top security people in the world. Yeah,
they're nation state sized, and they're private company.
But for some a nation state to take it upon themselves to perform this attack, they had to have a really high motivation, right, and be willing to basically raise the security level of all of these companies, specifically to the high level people who are running these companies and improve their security to make it harder to do this again. Yep. So there's a high motivation, but also I bet a lot of pissed off people that they've raised the awareness of these style of attacks.
Yep, they burned the pretext.
Yeah.
Yep. And they burned many other pretexts, I might argue.
Hey, I gotta be at ShmooCon in like 2 hours. Is there any way we can like do one more story and wrap this?
I'd say we just wrap it up now.
If you got one story that you really like,
Lee has one.
It's got to be really important.
Lee. Yes. I think Lee's is important.
Well, no, I'll pass on. I just threw it out there that we all hit on that OpenSMTP bug, which harken back to the Morris worm using the sendmail body for remote code execution. I just thought that was just a cool nostalgia story, and they've released a patch.
And the fact that it's a cool nostalgia story, that it was a script in both the subject and the body of an email processed by the OpenBSD SMTP server. But the fact that it was OpenBSD to begin with is ironic.
I mean... They're so known for being not broken or for being secure. It was just a surprise. And I just thought it was really cool and nostalgic, and I thought that would make a nice cap.
Yep. They're so tight you could rub two nickels together and a penny would fall out. But in this case, well, jackpot. Ding, 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 ding. Oh, God, it's Vegas all over again.
I still think the Citrix RCE is probably higher up on the list of attackers today.
Agreed.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure.
Yeah. And with that, we'll conclude the show. Larry, take us out.
Over and out.